this is a mysterious and even frightening case. This morning, that former Russian spy and his daughter remain in critical condition at an English hospital after being struck down Sunday by what authorities now believe was some kind of poison.
Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have been implicated in numerous cases of poisoning over the past 20 years.
For Putin, it's a way to send a message to others. If you spy against Russia, it will cost you your life.
The Russians are masters in the art of handling poison and have turned it into a strategic weapon.
5% шанс выжить, так не пугают, так хотят убить.
In each case, just a few grams of poison fuel a tug of war between the West and Russia.
What we've seen over the last 2 decades is Putin doing these kind of dark acts internationally, waiting for a response from Paris, from Washington, from Berlin.
Struggles for influence, territorial wars, battles over finances and energy.
Vladimir Putin will never let me go. He'll never forget me, because what I've done is unforgivable in his mind.
Each poisoning case is a move in a game of chess, being played since the Cold War, and sheds light on developments since the conflict with Ukraine began.
I'll never forget the members of my staff who were involved with Russia kept coming in and telling me, don't trust them. Do not trust the Russians.
By the end of the 2000s, former KGB agent Vladimir Putin had successfully established his own rules. He handles problems his way, with zero tolerance for criticism. A master of diversion, he is an ally in the war on terrorism. His duplicity works. The West lets its guard down. No Western leader foresees the return of a Cold War, at least for the time being. Dissenting voices, like that of William Browder, go unheard.
I had to figure out how to get justice for Sergei. He was killed, not for religious reasons or ideological reasons. He was killed for $230 million. And the people who stole that $230 million don't keep it in Russia, because as easily as they stole it, it can be stolen from them. They keep it in the West. And when I went to Washington in the spring of 2010, I thought it would be pretty easy to convince people that something should be done in a case like this. And what I discovered was that when President Obama came into power, he had created something called the Russian Reset.
I wanted to present you with a little gift which represents what President Obama and Vice President Biden and I have been saying, and that is, we want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay? We worked hard to get the right Russian word. Do you think we got it?
You get it wrong.
I got it wrong.
It should be перезагрузка. And this says перегрузка, which means overcharged.
Well, we won't let you do that to us, I promise.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
He was really keen on signing a nuclear weapons agreement because he had been awarded the Nobel Prize right before he was president for declaring that he wanted nuclear weapons to be eliminated.
I am committed to upholding this treaty. It is a centerpiece of my foreign policy. And I'm working with President Medvedev to reduce America and Russia's nuclear stockpiles. We can do that. That's the hope of all the world.
And so it created a real problem for us because human rights was one of the things he was ready to trade for his nuclear weapons agreement.
Barack Obama's America buries its head in the sand, it is not ready to sanction Russia. But all of that will change when the country uncovers a decade of deception. Russian agents are operating on its soil under false identities.
I'm Leon Panetta. I've had a long experience with dealing with Russia. When I was both CIA director and Secretary of Defense, I worked with both the intelligence officials in Russia as well as their defense ministers in dealing with defense issues. The hope was that ultimately we could develop a better relationship with Russia. And I tried to do that when I was director of the CIA. And I'll never forget that the members of my staff who were involved with Russia kept coming in and telling me, don't trust them. Do not trust the Russians. And when I heard about the spies that were located in this country, I knew they were right. The FBI had determined that the Russians had deployed 10 individuals into the United States. They had used an approach that I think goes back to the KGB, where you place an individual in a country and that person assumes a different identity, becomes part of a community, establishes credibility within that community. They were married, they had children, their children were in local schools, they were members of community organizations, some were teachers. They had really done a very good job of developing a very effective cover. We had tapes of them being paid by Russian individuals. A lot of them came out of the embassy or consulates that the Russians had. Their primary mission was to ultimately be able to get into a key agency and department in Washington. Their best hope was to be able to become part of the CIA, or become part of the FBI, or become part of the State Department, or even perhaps get a job in the White House. They were here for one purpose, and one purpose only, which was to get intelligence on what the United States was up to. The biggest challenge was that one of the individuals that was a spy was planning on returning to Russia. And we were worried that if that happened, it might undermine the whole effort to try to be able to catch all 10 of them. So we went to the White House. This was taking place at a time when President Obama and President Medvedev, who was head of Russia, were planning a summit to basically talk about important issues between the United States and Russia. The concern that was raised was that it could prove embarrassing, both to Medvedev as well as to the president. And so the decision was that we would allow President Obama and Medvedev to meet, and that as soon as Medvedev got into his plane and left the United States airspace, that we would then arrest all 10 spies.
10 Russian intelligence officers have been arrested, allegedly for spying on the U.S.
Barack Obama has no desire for a new Cold War. He stubbornly pursues his reset strategy. To force his hand, William Browder needs allies in the U.S. Congress. He approaches the Helsinki Commission, which is responsible for security and cooperation in Europe. The banker convinces a small group of officials and congressmen to work on drafting the Magnitsky Act. The Kremlin soon becomes aggravated by this alliance and puts the group on its most wanted list.
I like to call Putin's 11, because there were 11 of us. American officials or former officials wanted by Russia for being part of a transnational criminal group. The common thread was some association with the Magnitsky effort in the United States. My name's Kyle Parker. From 2006 to 2014, I was the advisor analyst for Russia at the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I first met Bill Browder in early 2009. Since the mid-90s, Bill Browder was a famous name on the Russian scene. And it was certainly memorable when the largest foreign investor was expelled from the country as a national security threat. And he said, well, let me tell you a story. And that was the first time that he had told the story of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, essentially in the U.S. Congress. It's a dynamite story. And I then spent the next couple months trying to dig dirt on the story, to sort of exposing any gaps in the facts or the logic. And I talked to whoever I could talk to, and anybody who I thought might be able to give me some compromise, some dirt on Bill Browder. And in the end, the story checked out. And not only did it check out, what I heard from a lot of the people I spoke to, and especially my own government, was that it's actually worse than he's telling you.
We are in the hearing room of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a room of history that has changed the course of the relationship between the United States and Russia and between the West and Russia, in terms of saying to Vladimir Putin, we will not accept your kind of behavior with impunity.
We'll never be able to bring Sergei back, but if through his death, his story can save the lives of others in similar situation, then his enormous sacrifice will at least not have been in vain. God bless Sergei Magnitsky.
It was shocking for members of Congress hearing that testimony of the Russian treatment of a critic who dared to highlight corruption. And there was very little sympathy for Russia left here in the United States Congress after that dramatic set of hearings and testimony, and enormous desire to respond.
Абсолютная гениальность закона Магнитского в том, что впервые в истории санкционной политики, впервые в истории международных отношений появилась идея точечных санкций. То есть не наказывать всю страну и все население этой страны, все граждан этой страны за действия авторитарного диктаторского режима, а конкретно наказывать тех людей, которые лично несут ответственность за нарушение прав граждан и лично несут ответственность за коррупцию.
Vladimir Kara-Murza joins William Browder in his struggle. At their side is Boris Nemtsov, one of Vladimir Putin's fiercest opponents. After so many years of being brushed aside with batons, The two hope the Magnitsky Act will be a chance to strike back.
В возрасте 18 лет я пришел работать с Борисом Немцовым. Борис Немцов стал самым заметным, самым ярким, самым сильным лидером политической оппозиции путинскому режиму, и он стал олицетворять движение за свободную, современную, нормальную европейскую Россию против всего того, что представлял собой путинский режим. Ну и, конечно, наверное, то, что Кремль считал наиболее опасным в том, что делал Борис Немцов, это его абсолютно ключевая роль в принятии закона Магнитского. Мы вместе с Борисом Немцовым провели десятки встреч с конгрессменами, с сенаторами. По поводу Билла Браудера, он всю свою жизнь посвятил поиску вот этой ответственности для тех людей, которые убили Сергея Магнитского. Но для нас, для представителей российской оппозиции, для представителей российского гражданского общества, было важно, чтобы этот закон имел более широкий характер, который распространял действия этих персональных санкций на всех нарушителей прав человека в России, а не только на фигурантов дела Магнитского.
Надо ввести санкции против негодяев. Список этих лиц, как хотите его называйте, вот списком присутствующих там, или списком Немцова, как угодно. Вот, список этих лиц должен начаться с фамилии Путин.
There's a code in the military that you never leave anybody behind. And that applies in intelligence as well. Russia had arrested a number of spies that were working both for the United States and Great Britain, who were in Russia, in Russian prisons. And we thought it made sense that if we could trade these 10 potential spies for those who had spied on behalf of the United States and Great Britain, that we could work out a fair trade. I arranged a phone call with Radkov, the head of the Russian intelligence. I said, I need to tell you something, that we have just arrested 10 spies who are yours, Russian spies. There was silence on the other side. And then Radkov came off and said, yes, they are ours. I just said, you know, we would like to be able to set up this kind of trade. And it was at that point that he said, let me check this out. I have to talk to Putin for his permission. It was the next day that he called and said that Putin had approved the exchange. Our plane with the 10 Russian spies and their families landed in Vienna at the same time that a Russian plane carrying our spies landed at the same airport. The Russian spies were delivered to the Russian plane, and our spies were delivered to our plane. One of them returned to Great Britain, and as is the case, the Russians never forgive. those who spy against their country. And an operation was conducted by the Russians that wound up poisoning one of these spies.
Vladimir Putin is ready to take risks that the Soviet leadership would not have been able or willing to take, that is more dangerous than the Cold War. I'm Mark Urban, I'm a journalist, and I had got quite interested in the idea of writing a book about espionage in the modern sense, and really the idea that things had become quite intense and difficult again between Russia and Western countries. In that context, Sergei Skripal was really good because he was somebody whose personal story was of having been an intelligence officer for the Soviet, then Russian state, having been turned by British intelligence to work for them, caught in a labor camp, and then exchanged. So his story was a fascinating story. So I decided to try and find him, which wasn't that difficult because he was on the electoral list, that's the voter list, in southern England, in the city of Salisbury, which is where he'd settled after the exchange. None of us suspected that he was about to be poisoned a few months later. Skripal was a Russian intelligence officer who worked for their military intelligence organization, which is known as the GRU. The GRU was an unreformed organization that still regarded Russia as being in a state of near war with Western countries. It was a time when Ronald Reagan was effectively rearming America. The Americans were sending cruise missiles to Sicily. That's what the Russians really wanted to know about. They wanted to try and recruit Americans who were working in Sicily on the cruise missile deployment. And Sergei Skripal was one of those guys who was going to be working in embassies trying to recruit spies. One thing was very clear talking to Sergei, which was that while we as Westerners regarded the coming of Boris Yeltsin and the democratic government in Russia in the early 90s in a very positive way, he and his colleagues in the GRU did not. Sergei became very disillusioned with what was going on. He could see chaos everywhere, the Soviet Union breaking up, trouble in many parts of Russia. He didn't feel any personal loyalty. He also felt great financial need, as many intelligence officers did in Russia at the time. The salary had been reduced vastly by inflation. This kind of disillusionment that Sergei had with the new authorities in Russia took him by a series of steps to the point where he was ready to betray the GRU and the Russian state. He was able to give MI6, British Intelligence Service, much more information about the attitude of the Russian military under Putin, the operations they were mounting. There were questions about the security of Russian nuclear weapons. There were questions about chemical weapons, biological weapons. And when Sergei Skripal produced his own organogram or organizational structure of the GRU, with all of the names written in of all of the officers who headed the different directorates and directions and departments and sections of this labyrinthine organization, it caused absolute astonishment at MI6 headquarters. They hadn't had anybody in a position like that who was willing to remain in the GRU and provide information for decades.
A high-ranking mole, Sergei Skripal, kept the British informed throughout Vladimir Putin's first term in office. Caught off guard, the former FSB boss launches a hunt. In Russian Secret Services lingo, the word for this is smash. death to spies.
When they started to get information from their own intelligence sources about actual real spies in the GRU who had been recruited by Western intelligence organizations, the FSB really put enormous resources into trying to work out who it was. And that's what led them to start to do surveillance on Sergei Skripal. They followed him to a meeting with British intelligence officers in Turkey. When he got back, they decided, near the end of 2004, to arrest him.
Скрипаля Сергея Викторовича признать виновным в совершении государственных измен, в формах выдачи государственной тайны представителям иностранной спецслужбы и шпионажа.
And he was sentenced to a long sentence in a labor camp, what was known as a penal colony in a part of central Russia called Mordovia, which had a long and terrible history of being a place where dissidents and people from the show trials of the 1930s were sent.
After 5 years of imprisonment in Russia, Sergei Skripal is summoned by the director of the penal colony. He is free. In a bid to retrieve his top operatives detained in the West, Vladimir Putin has agreed to release the old traitor.
Now, one of the things that had to happen was that he had to receive a presidential pardon. So he had to sign various papers that effectively involved confessing his crime, because you can't be pardoned unless you've actually agreed that you did something wrong. Sergei was taken to the fort, which is the MI6 training base on the south coast of England. He arrived there by helicopter. Then he spent weeks being debriefed, talking to MI6 officers about everything that had happened to him, what had happened in his interrogations, what he had or hadn't admitted to, all those kinds of things. And then after a few weeks of that, he was effectively free. He was in a little house in Salisbury in Wiltshire, trying to live a normal life. And it was agreed that his wife and kids should be able to join him. MI6 believed that the fact that Sergei had been pardoned in 2010 as part of his release by the Russian president meant that the Russians, taking their sort of legalistic and rather formal attitude to these things, had effectively forgiven him and wouldn't come after him. But obviously they were wrong.
As Moscow plots its revenge, opponents Vladimir Kara-Murza and Boris Nemtsov increase their visits to Washington, together with William Browder. The Magnitsky trio hopes to secure the largest vote possible to create bulletproof legislation. To do this, they must convince both Republicans and Democrats of the need to sanction Russia.
I got a list of all the Republicans, and I looked down the list, and there was one name that jumped right out of that list for me. He was the most powerful Republican in the Senate, and that was Senator John McCain of Arizona. John McCain had been tortured in a Vietnamese prison camp in the same way as Sergei was tortured in Russian prison. From that moment on, Senator McCain became my biggest ally in Washington.
What is even more tragic is that the case of Mr. Magnitsky is only one of the most extreme examples of the broad and dramatic deterioration of rule of law in Russia and its replacement with arbitrary and nearly unchecked state power, which is increasingly concentrated in the hands of one man, President Vladimir Putin.
We had to work very careful in, I like to think of it, finding a dance partner. And so we built the co-sponsorship out in twos so that in both chambers,
who tell me Russia can do better.
A Democratic senator.
And they urge us to move forward with the Magnitsky Accountability Act.
We need to find a Republican partner.
We in Congress are united in our support for those fighting for democracy and human rights in Russia.
We found a Republican senator. Let's find another Democratic partner.
Today is the 3rd anniversary of the death of Sergei Magnitsky, in whose honor Title IV this bill is named.
So that the outside world, the Obama administration, the press, the Russian government, were watching an effort that always had bipartisan support, that never could be dismissed as a partisan attack.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? The ayes are 92, the nays are 4. The bill is passed. The majority leader.
Это было почти 90% голосов в Палате представителей и более 90% голосов в американском Сенате. И у Барака Обамы уже не оставалось никакого выбора после того, как с таким перевесом был принят закон. Понятно, что он вынужден был его подписать, и закон вступил в силу.
I never expected the Magnitsky Act to pass. To get a U.S. law passed is like, I mean, less likely than winning the lottery. It's the first time in 35 years that the United States had a sanctions law against Russia. So I was stunned, but so was Vladimir Putin.
I do remember how extremely agitated the Russians were, both here in Washington and in Moscow, to the idea of the Magnitsky Act, let alone its adoption. They reacted in a very hostile manner to that typical Russian denial that anything like this happened. And in fact, Magnitsky was not only not a victim, he was actually a perpetrator. He was corrupt himself and deserved all he got. And that we had no business interfering in what they construed as the sovereign internal affairs of Russia.
We actually provided 282 names to the U.S. government. Only about 50 of them have been sanctioned, and so there's still more work to be done. And what it means is that, particularly being sanctioned by the United States, is that you can't open a bank account anywhere in the world because no Western institution wants to be in violation of U.S. Treasury sanctions. If you apply for a visa, into any place you really want to travel to, the visa officer is going to type in your name and see, wow, this person's on a human rights sanctions list. They're not going to give you a visa. So you're pretty much confined to Russia and confined, and if you have money offshore, you can't get access to it. And so it kind of ruins their lives, not in the way I'd like to ruin their lives. I'd like them to go to jail. That's a proper consequence for torture and murder. But it's better than nothing, which is what was available to us before.
Это чисто политический, недружественный акт. Мы, конечно, должны соответствующим образом реагировать, и Министерство иностранных дел сразу сказало об этом, что ответ будет. Но то, что Госдума взяла на себя эту инициативу, мне представляется абсолютно правильно.
Я думаю, что где-то к началу 2010-х годов у Путина сложилась уже вполне полная и такая очень успокоительная для него картина мира. Все будет хорошо. Никто ничего не может с нами сделать, потому что у всех есть свои интересы. Все думают о своих избирателях, все думают о своей экономике, все думают о своих финансах. В этой картине мира внезапно случился один неожиданный элемент. И это был закон Магнитского. Поэтому именно на акт Магнитского и на людей, которые были к нему причастны, направился весь гнев Путина и все инструменты давления, которые он мог для этого использовать. Так вот, в конце 2012 года появился законопроект. Россия запрещает людям в Соединенных Штатах усыновлять российских детей, прежде всего российских больных детей.
This bill is called the Dima Yakovlev Law, named for a little Russian boy adopted in the United States who died after being left in the family car parked in the hot sun. In reality, the fate of Russian children is of little concern to the Duma. The law was drafted and passed as a matter of urgency, a few days after the U.S. Congress passed the Magnitsky Act.
И тогда многие журналисты занимались этим, и я был один из тех, кто нашел этот файл и показал этот файл, и название этого файла – «Магнитский текст». И всем стал понятен смысл этого, что детей запрещают усыновлять для того, чтобы ответить на акт Магнитского.
То есть за персональные санкции против кремлевских воров и коррупционеров они отыгрались на российских детях.
Dozens of American families hoping to adopt a child from Russia are devastated tonight.
Seems like it's just really an offense on the children. And
it's really using kids as a pawn in a political system.
We would love for the Russian government to reconsider.
After going after the American families who are adopting, they went after me. And Russia has been chasing me around the world, issuing Interpol arrest warrants, 8 warrants for my arrest through Interpol, trying to bring me back to Russia so they can kill me just like they killed Sergei Magnitsky. I've either found out about it in advance or I've been able to thwart it before I got into trouble. And so I've been lucky each time.
For Vladimir Putin, the name of the game is escalation. He starts a territorial war in Ukraine in 2014, sending an unmarked army of mercenaries and soldiers to annex Crimea, and then attacking the Donbas region to prevent what he claims is the genocide of the Russian-speaking population. The Russian opposition springs into action. It's obvious to Boris Nemtsov. The peace and security of the European continent are in jeopardy.
Он мог организовывать огромные митинги и демонстрации против власти, против Путина. Это человек, который вот уже готовый потенциальный президент, и одно это уже делало его опасным для Кремля.
Мы должны сказать «нет войне», мы должны сказать «хватит маразму», мы должны сказать «Россия и Украина без Путина», «Россия и Украина без Путина». И последнее – слава России, слава Украине!
Кремль по-разному нейтрализовывал своих политических оппонентов. Кого-то покупали, кого-то запугивали, кого-то вынуждали уехать из страны, кого-то сажали. Бориса Немцова невозможно было ни купить, ни запугать, ни заставить замолчать каким-либо другим способом. И его заставили замолчать тем единственным способом, которым это было возможно сделать. Для меня этот день навсегда разделил жизнь на до и после. Знаете, как красная черта такая прошла. Только закончили ужинать, это пятница вечер была. Объявили эту новость. Я не поверил сначала, никто не поверил. И я выскочил на улицу, поймал такси, поехал на этот мост.
La police russe parle d'un assassinat minutieusement planifié au sujet du meurtre de l'opposant Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov a été abattu de 4 balles dans le dos alors qu'il traversait ce pont avec sa compagne ukrainienne à 2 pas du Kremlin.
Здесь убит один из лучших людей России! Слава героям! Слава героям России!
И мы все знаем, какова цена за противостояние путинскому режиму. Я абсолютно убежден, что одним из главных факторов в решении Владимира Путина отдать приказ на убийство Бориса Немцова это было именно участие Немцова и ключевая роль, которую он сыграл в принятии закона Магнитского в США. Ну и то, что касается моих отравлений, в моем случае это была не только главная, а единственная причина.
Мы, я и дети, живем в Соединенных Штатах уже много лет. Володя считает, что может продолжать свою деятельность полноценно, так как он это делает, если его семья будет в безопасности. Мне хочется быть хорошим примером для своих детей, примером того, как нужно бороться за то, что ты любишь, за то, что для тебя ценно.
We're not asking for your support. It is our task to change Russia, and we will do it ourselves. The only thing we ask from you is that you stop supporting Mr. Putin by treating him as a respectable and worthy partner on the world stage. And above all,
Как нельзя позволять страху остановить тебя в этой борьбе.
and please stop falling for the lie that Russians are somehow
Мы вот на протяжении 22 лет являемся свидетелями того, как сотрудник КГБ, пришедший к власти, постепенно загоняет страну в страшную черную дыру. Было понятно, что сотрудник КГБ может действовать только методами, используемыми КГБ. Все стало понятно в 2015 году, когда в феврале у стен Кремля был убит Борис Немцов, Володин близкий друг, соратник и крестный нашей дочери. А всего лишь через пару месяцев после убийства Бориса Немцова первый раз был отравлен Володя.
Это было посреди дня, я сидел с двумя коллегами в офисе в центре Москвы. И вдруг случайно почувствовал, что мне тяжело дышать. И я почувствовал, что начинает биться сердце, что я весь покрываюсь потом, что падает давление, что меня начинает рвать. И в течение буквально нескольких минут я уже не смог ни сесть, ни встать. И мои коллеги перенесли меня, положили на диван, вызвали скорую помощь. И я очень быстро потерял сознание, а происходило то, что один за другим отключались все органы. Легкие, печень, почки, сердце, просто все перестало работать. Я проходил медицинскую реабилитацию за рубежом, в Америке. Врачи сказали моей жене, что шанс выжить примерно 5%. Я был в коме несколько недель, очень долго из нее выходил, очень долго пришлось восстанавливаться, пришлось учиться заново ходить, пришлось учиться заново держать вилку, ложку, пришлось заново вообще восстанавливать все базовые функции человеческого организма. Самым большим подарком путинскому режиму со стороны представителей оппозиции было бы, если бы мы все просто разбежались. Я им таких подарков делать не собираюсь. Российский политик должен быть в России. Это не может быть никак иначе. Я вернулся, как только смог. Если говорить о мерах безопасности, ну, какие тут можно принять меры безопасности? Невозможно же не есть, не пить, не ходить по улицам, не одеваться. Стараешься не думать об этом, потому что иначе станешь параноиком, если каждую минуту ходить и дергаться, а что будет дальше? Просто ты принимаешь эти риски, принимаешь эту цену. А потом он случился еще раз.
Второе отравление имело место в 2017 году. Нам удалось вывести образцы крови Володиной на анализы, которые проводились здесь в какой-то лаборатории ФБР. ФБР не смогло определить яд, которым Володя был отравлен, но вот в их отчете говорится о том, что, по их мнению, это было отравление неустановленным биотоксином. Большая часть данных этих анализов были засекречены. Володя пытался получить результаты через суд. Это заняло большое количество времени. И все равно то, что мы получили, большая часть информации была просто вымарана в бумагах. Опять же, о причинах можно долго рассуждать, но мы знаем, например, что был визит высших чинов российских спецслужб в Вашингтон, и после этого ФБР сказала о том, что большая часть данных засекречена.
The poisonings of Vladimir Kara-Murza do not make headlines. Despite his military incursions into Crimea and the Donbas, Vladimir Putin isn't considered a pariah. Russia is excluded from the G8, but remains a member of the G20. The Kremlin's master is a member who is not only welcome, but sought after. Economy overrides politics, and the West is mired in its compromises. Yet no one is safe, not even those who thought they had been overlooked.
I was in the office on the 5th of March, 2018, and there had been a story very briefly in the news about an incident being declared at Salisbury Hospital that morning.
This is a mysterious and even frightening case. This morning, that former Russian spy and his daughter remain in critical condition, and authorities now believe was some kind of poison.
I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. I mean, I hadn't spoken to Sergei for a few months before that happened. It didn't take that long for some people at the hospital to start suspecting that it might be a form of nerve agent or organophosphate type poison. You saw sections of the town being closed. You saw the fire brigade going in to decontaminate people in hazmat. And really what happened was big parts of the centre of Salisbury were shut down. These scenes were completely unprecedented. And then, like a day or two later, narrowing it down and saying, well, it's got a very particular signature of one of these nerve agents developed by Russia in the 90s, Novichok. The whole thing grew as it became clear that serving members of the GRU were suspected of coming to this country and were on CCTV. They hadn't hidden their identities. And that was like a signature to the poisoning. This is the Russian state. The British government had no real option but to take a strong public stance against Russia for this.
Thank you. Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. Our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
Sergei Skripal and his daughter survive. Britain expels 23 Russian diplomats, the US 60. France and Germany are content to send back 4 each, nothing more. Vladimir Putin is able to revel in the spectacle of Western dithering, to meet Donald Trump face-to-face on the new American president's European tour.
Putin was very cold-blooded in his approach to international affairs. He knew what Russia's interests were, and he intended to advance them. His meeting with Trump was potentially, therefore, very dangerous for the United States because Trump didn't understand what he was facing. I'm John Bolton, and I was the National Security Advisor to President Trump. I'd started in April 2018, and this particular trip was for 3 summits, one with NATO, one with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May at the time, and then with Putin. So this was a very, very heavy agenda on a relatively short trip. When Trump met with Prime Minister May, the main meeting was at the Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country estate. The situation we thought had stabilized. It hadn't really gone away for the British. They were still quite agitated about it. It was not a meeting that was intended to produce an agreement on anything specific. It was really so that Trump would have the benefit of British views last before the upcoming meeting with Putin in Helsinki. I asked Theresa May about the Skripal attempted assassination. I asked if she would give her view why the Russians had done it. I did that for a particular reason. I wanted Trump to hear from May that the Russians were capable of carrying out assassination on the territory of a foreign government. The British clearly thought that this was a Russian effort to see if they could carry out an assassination attempt, extricate the people trying to conduct the murder, and then escape any consequences for it.
Today, we've also discussed how we can deepen our work together to respond to malign state activity, terrorism, and serious crime. In particular, on Russia, I thanked President Trump for his support in responding to the appalling use of a nerve agent in Salisbury, after which he expelled 60 Russian intelligence officers. We agreed that it is important to engage Russia from a position of strength and unity, and that we should continue to deter and counter all efforts to undermine our democracies.
They were determined in London that the Russians were going to suffer consequences for it, and they felt that it was important that the West as a whole remain solidly behind the condemnation that they had expressed about what Russia had done. But for Trump, he thought, okay, we've expelled the diplomats, that's basically the end of it.
President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Я уже вижу, что там смотрю некоторые информационные источники. Ваши коллеги там проталкивают мысль, что этот господин Скрипаль чуть ли не правозащитник какой-то. Он просто шпион, предатель Родины. Понимаете? Есть такое понятие – предатель Родины. Вот представьте себе, у вас есть. Вы гражданин своей собственной страны. Значит, и вдруг возникает у вас человек, который предает свою страну. Как вы к нему отнесетесь? Или любой здесь сидящий, представитель любой страны. Он просто подонок. Вам спасибо большое.
At the end of the 2010s, Vladimir Putin remains in control. From the Donbas region to Salisbury, the warning lights flash. The war is already here, at the gates of Europe, which refuses to see it, to name it, to consider it. The question is no longer whether the poison will strike, but who it will strike.
У меня не было никаких сомнений с самого начала, что это намеренное отравление, что это отравление с целью убить, а не напугать. Но в 2021 году мы получили фактические доказательства этого. И это журналистское расследование установило имена 4 сотрудников Федеральной службы безопасности. Это та же команда, тот же эскадрон смерти ФСБ, который участвовал в отравлении Алексея Навального.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.